This is Chad with BeGoneForGood. I make videos all about adventure motorcycling, from the bikes to the trips I've taken to DIY tips and tricks and things of that nature. Everything to deal with adventure motorcycling. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in seeing more of, definitely feel free to subscribe to the channel because we will be producing a lot of content, especially coming up here in 2020. For today's episode, I wanted to talk a little bit about my first off-road experience when I did the Utah BDR this past year, and the things that I would do differently for my next off-roading adventure, and specifically if I was ever to head back to Lockhart Basin on the Utah BDR. For anybody who's paid attention to the channel and has followed along with us, you know that my trip out to the Utah BDR was a really big deal because it was my first true off-roading adventure. It was the first time I really ever got the tires dirty in anything more than a gravel road or a little forest lane, something along those lines. This was real off-roading. The Utah BDR is a pretty extreme version of an off-road route. There were sections that were expert only. I clearly wasn't, as it was my first time ever being out on an off-road adventure. I hadn't done any real training other than watching videos and stuff, but no practical on-the-ground training when it came to mud or sand or rocks or hills. All of that was basically brand new to me, and I was very excited to get the chance to ride in that environment and see how I fared. I went along with two of my buddies who were similarly probably closer to novices off-road, not brand new. One of them had ridden a bike in his youth doing dirt biking, and another had done some light off-roading and a little bit of the TAT a couple of years back. But all of us were expecting a pretty healthy learning curve as we stepped into the Utah BDR. So some of the things that I have here might be very obvious to people that have been riding for a long time, but I think it's probably a good idea to remember some of these things, even if you are well-versed in what it takes to be off-road, just because it doesn't hurt to be reminded. The first is water. Bring more water than you ever think you're going to need, because there is that potential that you can run through it. I didn't think about this. I brought probably about 2 liters of water with me on the trip, which was way below what I needed. I probably needed something closer to about 2 gallons. We were riding through the high desert in what amounted to pretty much early summer, mid-June. 95 degrees was not hard for us to hit, and picking up the bike and maneuvering the bike in those off-road environments will just make you sweat like you wouldn't believe, especially if you're in full gear. I didn't have a jersey and like armor. I was actually in a full adventure jacket, so I was really hot the entire time, sweating a ton, and not replacing that with nearly enough water, which I think over the long term really ended up becoming a detriment to my experience off-road, specifically at Lockhart. So my suggestion to you would be find a way to pack more water. Any bladders that you have, use them. Any plastic bottles that you have, use them. Carry as much water as possible on that bike if you're going to be doing an off-road excursion, especially in Utah with the temperatures going way high out there. The air is super dry. It's going to be really important to get water, especially because as you get more and more dehydrated, you start kind of losing your faculties. You're not making as good calls when it comes to judgment. You're starting to get a little bit worried, or at least I was, about whether or not I was going to be able to maintain through the evening without having any water. Luckily, one of the guys that we were traveling with happened to bring a filter along with, so I ran out of water about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We continued riding all the way till 7 o'clock that night, when we decided we were probably going to have to stay overnight. If he didn't have a filter, I would have somehow had to figure out how to spend the night and get up the next morning and get out without any water, and I was already pretty tapped to begin with. My head was not feeling good. The headaches were starting to set in. I'd be worried to see what could have happened if we didn't have that filter handy and able to filter out a couple extra liters for all of us to get out that next day. But it seems super simple. It seems really obvious, but make sure that you're bringing more water. When we first started looking at the Utah BDR, I was told by tons of people not to do it, not to do the Lockhart Basin specifically, because it is an expert-only route and something that somebody like me as a newbie probably wouldn't be prepared for. This was my clearest indication that I wasn't prepared for what was coming. I made a lot of errors when it came to getting water out there and treating myself accordingly to make sure that I could be successful with this trip. Obviously we made it out. I am alive today, but my one and my first position would be always make sure you've got more water with you than you think you need, twice as much water than you think is necessary, because it's going to be so vital for you while you're out there working really hard. The second point I would make is plan accordingly. I think that one of the issues that we had is we got a late start. We didn't really think about how long we were going to have to be out there, and it ended up kind of getting over top of us. Like, I think we left at about 10 or 11 o'clock to do Lockhart Basin, and our expectation was that we were going to be able to finish it that day. We didn't, and we got kind of stuck out there without water. We got stuck out there having to use our tents and everything, which luckily we had with us, but we were not expecting to have to spend the night out there, and I think that kind of got over top of us. So plan accordingly. Make sure that if you have an opportunity, drop as much gear as you possibly can. Get your bike as light as possible. Make sure that you've dialed in your suspension. Make sure you've dialed in your modes, if you've got like a gravel mode or an off-road mode, or can eliminate the traction control. If you can take classes beforehand, like all of this is part of your planning process for a route like this. Again, I didn't do any of that. I went out there as cold as I possibly could with really no idea of what I was getting into. I was apprehensive and I was anxious about it, but that was about it. That was the only preparation that I did, was just getting scared of it. And it definitely showed in the way that we went through there. So any sort of planning or prep that you can do beforehand is going to be a benefit to you while you're on that trail, because again, it is tougher than you might expect. It is going to put you through it a little bit. There are tons of videos out there. I've included my own up there from the Utah BDR. Watch them and see what people are going through as they're riding through Lockhart. You'll notice that even if you go to the Utah BDR, the Backcountry Discovery Route movie that they did, there's not a lot of video from the roughest sections. So if you're watching that video and it looks tough, the hardest parts they didn't even shoot. And I'm guessing because they're on 1200 GSs and big KTMs, they probably did a lot of work for themselves to get through that portion and didn't necessarily want to film it. So recognize that if the stuff that you're seeing there looks difficult, it only gets tougher. Okay, so plan accordingly for that. The third point, make sure you're working as a team. This is one of the things that I fell down on probably worst of all. My attitude as it started getting later in the day and I realized we weren't going to make it through and I was running out of water and I didn't have food, my attitude started really sucking and I became a real detriment to the team at that point. Make sure you rely on your partners, on the people that are out there, especially if you're riding a big bike the way I was on the Africa Twin. You are going to need their help to pick up that bike over and over again. You're going to need their help to navigate through different courses and pick different lines and recognize how you need to get up and down these hills and these rocky terrains. It's best to make sure that you're with a team. I would suggest no less than 3 people, just because that allows you the capability, if you have to and somebody gets hurt, to leave a man there with that person and send one person off. I would argue that 4 would be even better, so that 2 can go, 2 can stay. But ultimately, make sure that you're relying on your team. Make sure that you're sticking with your buddies, that you're picking them up, because everybody tends to get a little bit frustrated, a little bit disappointed. And once you start making errors like that, or once your attitude drops, things start kind of going sideways for you really quickly. I don't think the water was necessarily the worst portion of what happened out there, but that, along with my attitude dropping, those 2 just kind of cascaded further and further down, making both of them much bigger factors than I think they needed to be. And ultimately, if it wasn't for my 2 teammates that were out there, if it wasn't for my 2 partners that were out there, I think that I might not have made it off that trail nearly as well as I did. They kept picking me up, they kept walking me through, making sure that I took baby steps to get out of there, and I appreciate them for doing that, because I know that that wasn't easy when they were going through their own hardships while we were on that trail. So always stick with your team. The last one I'd like to talk about is take your time. This is not an easy trail. This is not something to blow through at 50 miles an hour. There are some really difficult sections. Make sure that you're taking the time to look around you. Make sure that you're taking the time to watch the terrain ahead of you. I had a couple of accidents because I wasn't paying attention to what was in front of me, instead looking at the view around me. Luckily, they were in pretty benign areas where I fell in sand and brush, but it would be very easy to come up over one of these rocky hills and not notice that it's taking a 90-degree turn in front of you while you looked at the vista that also appeared. Make sure you're paying attention to the road that's in front of you. Make sure that you're taking the time to have a break, to eat a little bit, to drink a little bit. Get yourself back to a center line so that when you're on the bike, you're paying attention and you're focused on what you're doing. This is not an easy route. It's obviously easier the better the rider you are, but it's still not an easy route, and there are some areas that can get a little hairy if you're not paying attention, if you're not doing what you're supposed to do. The other part of taking your time, don't expect to rip through this thing in 5 hours or 6 hours. Pack as though you're going to be out there for a night. If you end up getting through it, fine, great. Then all that stuff is kind of just extra gear that you've got available for you when you get home. But if you need it and you're out there and you're stuck out there the way that we were, you're going to want to have a tent. You're going to want to have your sleeping bag as it gets a little bit chilly out there. You're going to want to make sure you have extra food and extra water and provisions for getting up that following day and getting off there. The worst thing you can do is basically what we did, is hustle a lot further than you should have, a lot faster than you should have, because you want to get out as quickly as possible. That is a situation where you're going to start making some bad calls, some bad judgment errors, and things can get a little bit dangerous. So plan for it going longer than you think it's going to go. Plan for having extra water than you think you're going to need, extra food more than you think you're going to need. And that way you can enjoy the ride, you can enjoy the experience, and not be rushing through it to the point where it gets dangerous for you or your team. That's really not the way to go. Now, for all of you who have listened to some of the videos before about Utah, I've said that I'm never doing it again. It was a really rough experience for me, mostly because mentally I wasn't prepared for what I was coming into. I think physically we could have gotten through it. We had guys to pick up the bike. We were both strong. We're all strong and able and capable of doing it. But what really, really hurt me was my mental attitude. My mental attitude started really cascading really quickly and crumbling when the water started going out, and I realized we weren't going to make it out in that day. So if you mentally prepare yourself, I think that your ride can be a much better experience than mine was. I think that you can really enjoy yourself out there a lot more than I did. We will likely be going on more off-roading trips. I have since this trip done some off-road training with the DART team, nothing extensive, but I've gotten a little bit of extra instruction, which I will tell you can go miles and miles ahead of just riding or just doing it yourself. Having somebody out there to say, hey, I saw that you did this, change this little element and the ride will go a lot better for you. Change this little thing and you'll be a little bit better. They also challenge you in different ways. DART is a class, an organization that I would suggest anytime I could. Bill Dragoo and his sons do a fantastic job with that training. But anywhere you can get training, even if it's somebody local, even if it's an opportunity to go out there with just somebody who has done this type of stuff before, maybe not an official trainer, but somebody who has some experience, get out there and talk to them about what you can learn before you go on a trip like this, and it will all help you out. This is, I would argue, sort of like a final exam, that every question that you learn and every question that you get right is a better score for you. And ultimately, when it comes to off-road riding, you want to get every one of those questions right. So study hard, cram as much as you can, watch the videos that you can, prep as much as you can, and then when you get on site, make sure that you're taking care of yourself when it comes to water and food and shelter, just in case you get stuck out there. Lockhart Basin is something that you could absolutely do as a newbie. Make sure that you're bringing your head along with you. Make sure that you're bringing your mental game along with you. It can be done. I did it myself, and I am by far one of the newest of the newbies. I have no capability when it comes to this sector, so if I can do it, I'm sure you can get through it. Just make sure that you're preparing properly. And if you have any questions for me, feel free to leave it down in the comments. Feel free to get in touch with me on the blog or on Facebook, and I can answer anything you need to know about Lockhart. And hopefully someday I might see you back out on the trail. Thank you very much for watching Be Gone for Good. Subscribe if you like what you're hearing, if you'd like to get more content from us. And again, if you have any questions or anything, leave it down in the comments. Thanks a lot.